and the sounds that they make.
Inside those waters, a large algae bloom, the beginning of this disaster. Frustrated residents forced to put up with the putrid green slime.
As they break along the shore, never more to pass this way again. Never more to pass this way again.
We have two major problems: the discharge from the lake, bringing a lot of fresh water into the system, and then all the septic tanks that are also draining into the system with fecal coliform bacteria.
The world that we live in is fragile and fair, a gift of God's grace that the angels have placed in our care. It's our legacy, my friend. Never more to pass this way again.
Unprecedented.
We now know it's toxic.
Florida's governor declaring a state of emergency in 4 counties.
Only passing through here, I know. So much to do before I go. Never more to pass this way again. Never more to pass this way again. Never more to pass this way again.
This is an issue that affects every Floridian in South Florida. It's not just the coastal estuaries, it's not just the ecology of the lake and Everglades, it's our quality of life, it's our local economy, and all of the things that people come to South Florida to enjoy. If the problem isn't solved, we're not going to have the water that we need to supply 8 million Floridians with clean, fresh water. We're not going to have a legacy of the Florida Everglades to pass on to our children. We're not going to have strong coastal economies with strong sport fishing and commercial fishing. We're not going to be able to enjoy the things that we enjoy today.
What we arrived and found here was a special paradise. What we may be leaving if we don't solve this problem is not a paradise.
And I do say atrocities because in many ways we have and continue to do things to our environment, and we choose to ignore the reality of how important they are.
We need storage north of the lake, we need storage east of the lake, west of the lake, and south.
But we're kind of in a circular firing field, and everybody's shooting at us, and everybody wants us to be doing something different, wants our land, wants us to do something else.
Well, it's really, really hard to take. It makes me want to cry whenever you see how damn bad things have gotten. And most of it has to do with greed or lack of good common sense.
So the major issues we have in the Caloosahatchee are the fact that we get too much fresh water during the wet season and too little fresh water during the dry season.
I think one of the things that my discipline, my science of ecology, teaches us is that we're all connected. You know, water connects us all.
It's the greatest lake in the world, and that's why people come from all over the world to fish here. All over the world. This is their dream spot. This is a very famous lake.
So Lake Okechobeee is really the heart of the entire system. But when the hurricanes hit the lake, we only had a small earthen dike around the lake. So because it was already draining much faster than it did previously, there was a huge volume of water that was in the lake at the time of the hurricanes. So that was why it was so devastating. That's why they lost almost 3,000 lives as a result of the 26 and 28 hurricanes.
That storm came in from the East Coast and broke about 25 miles of levee. The construction of the levee began in 1931 by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and it was completed in 1937.
Using a dredge and fill concept, so materials were just dredged from around the lake and piled up in order to create levees. And those materials were not the best engineering solution, not something that we would use today, and so water seeps through that.
So historically, Lake Okeechobee and the Everglades were directly connected. It flowed gradually from the northern portion of the Kissimmee, just south of Orlando, through Lake Okeechobee, through a process called sheet flow. It moved very, very slowly over a matter of weeks to months to get to the Everglades and into Florida Bay. Today, with the Herbert Hoover Dike, that water and the ditching and draining of the Kissimmee watershed, that water moves into Lake Okeechobee and into the Everglades within a matter of days. So with that, you've eliminated all of the oxbows and meanders within the rivers to the north of Lake Okeechobee that would have helped to reduce the nutrients that now today move right directly into the channelized canals and into Lake Okeechobee. You may hear some terms that you're not familiar with. We have a water problem and people want it simplified. In a nutshell, here are the problems. Runoff from the heavy rainfall in the Kissimmee River watershed fills Lake Okeechobee 6 times faster than we can discharge water from the lake. The greater volume of water that comes from the Kissimmee and fills the lake puts pressure on the Herbert Hoover Dike. As the lake fills up and there's pressure put on the Herbert Hoover Dike, the water managers, the Army Corps of Engineers and the South Fork Water Management District have a responsibility to lower water levels in the lake to protect the communities that surround the lake. Freshwater containing nutrients and pollutants mix with the saltwater, creating a favorable condition for algae blooms, such as the toxic blue-green algae blooms that we experienced this past summer. And that can impact our beaches and marinas, and obviously has an economic impact to our coastal communities, as well as a potential health impact for those folks that recreate and enjoy our coastal waters.
Well, we've always been part of the solution. We were a problem, so is everybody else in South Florida. Every single area in South Florida is discharging phosphorus, whether it be from septic tanks, stormwater discharge, parking lots, whatever it is. Everybody else expects the government to pay for that cleanup. In our case, we're paying part of the cost for the cleanup. Nobody else can claim the success story in their areas, and we now have the task of achieving the east, west, and north of the lake to get the same kind of success story.
The early drainage efforts were a failure simply because they failed to manage Lake Okeechobee properly. So it's been more than 90 years that the state of Florida has consciously sacrificed the coastal region, the economy, and the environment for the benefit of those areas south of Lake Okeechobee.
You know what causes the main problem? The muck. Because the muck stays. The water leaves.
Part of our problem is that, decades and decades of water coming into the lake laden with nitrogen and phosphorus has accumulated a muck layer within the lake. That is often resuspended when we have storm events like we saw in 2005, in 2006 when a number of hurricanes passed over Lake Okeechobee. But we also see the same thing in the rivers and estuaries near the water control structures. For example, at the Franklin Lock and Dam, that structure, as well as all of the structures within the system, open from the bottom. And so when we have large amounts of fresh water moving through those structures, they often resuspend the muck on the bottom. And that can bring in to the estuaries large amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus.
So you might ask, why would they not give the clean water, run the water over the top, lower the gates and let the clean water come down? Well, that's because the lake community wants the clean water on top for drinking water, and what you're talking about discharging is unwanted water.
We wouldn't build that system today, but they built it given the knowledge that they had 100 years ago. Same thing with our development practices. And so you look at what was the water quality standards of developments that were built in the 60s and 70s. Well, they didn't really put a lot of time and thought into that. And there's been a dramatic change. If you look at the developments that are coming online today, what they're required to do from a water quality perspective, it's much higher.
I don't believe that there's a black hat per se. There were just major mistakes done 100 years ago, which maybe at the time was state-of-the-art science and engineering. But obviously what they have done is basically killed or is killing the Everglades and the estuaries. The end result is going to be years and years of work to fix all the plumbing that they put in place.
I see every day the amount of people every year that keep coming in and populating Florida, and the development that continues to grow, and the amount of concrete and asphalt that we continue to add. And it takes away from the area for our water to settle and naturally disperse, and it creates more runoff and so forth.
I think one of the shortcomings of trying to approach these problems is if we could only go back to the way it was. People are not going to leave, and people are not going to stop coming here. So we really have to figure out how to put people on the land in a more sustainable way that has less of a negative impact on the environment. So I may be naive or a desperate optimist, but I believe we can do that.
We set out and we took off, and that was our desire and our dream, and it took 3 years to circumnavigate the eastern United States. Well, this is a journey of 7,000 miles, which in a trawler we go 7 miles an hour. Well, we first started getting involved in the water issues when in January we had that horrendous rain that literally changed the color of the water.
When we were on the water, it gave us a new perspective of appreciating water. When you live in a small confined space and you carry your water with you, it gives you a higher respect because you have to use the water you have carefully and then replenish that. It's amazing to me that the price of water now has surpassed the price of gasoline. People get enraged about the fact that they're paying more per gallon of gas. They're actually paying more for water. And that doesn't seem to bother anyone anymore.
One of the things we saw in the loop is that when the algae covered the water, there were no birds around, that was for sure. And we saw, Lake Erie even hitting a whole patch of algae up there. And they say it's primarily from the fertilizer, but whatever it's from, it really made a difference.
The one thing that troubles me is that almost everyone's recommendations for solutions, it has a 20 or 30 year span, and I don't feel that we have that time. We can send people to the moon and have wonderful space programs, but yet it's going to take 20 or 30 years to clean up the water in one river or two rivers.
They built the new Panama Canal in less than 5 years. You'd think it would be possible for us to build some sort of mechanism to move the water into the Everglades in that time frame at least.
The environmental community is in pretty sound agreement that we need more storage throughout the system, and a key component of that is storage, treatment, and conveyance from Lake Okeechobee south to the Everglades.
Every other place I've ever lived, the people who had a deep concern about protecting ecological function and maintaining a healthy environment tended to coalesce around a particular group. So in one place it might be Audubon, in another place it might be the Sierra Club, in another place it might be some local group that got started around some preserve or something. When I got down here, I was kind of dumbfounded by the fact that every one of those groups exist. You know, there's dozens of environmental groups down here, and sometimes they're fighting against one another.
And then when that water comes through the lake and comes south to the sugar farmer, we're actually filtering this water. All our nutrient levels are below the expected values that are set, you know, from a state and federal law. And, you know, we're more than doing our part. We contributed hundreds of millions of dollars in implementing this process. And, you know, and we still get blamed for something that's really not our fault.
There are a number of things that the people, you know, that have been working on Everglades restoration do have consensus on. I think we know that we need storage north of the lake, we need storage south of the lake, and we need storage east and west of the lake. And we need to provide clean water to the Everglades National Park and Florida Bay to ensure that those systems can survive.
So one of the significant impact that we have on our drinking water supply is the threat of nutrient pollution. And water coming south from Lake Okeechobee that is terribly sick needs to be cleansed. One of the things that we're working on this 12-day Road to Restoration trip is talking about ensuring that we can send that water south, build a reservoir to allow us to store that during the wet season and allow Mother Nature to do her job in cleansing it and then begin to send that water south during the dry season.
I believe that what we ought to do is to acquire in some way, shape, or fashion areas to store water south of Lake Okeechobee, west of Lake Okeechobee, and even some to the north and east of Lake Okeechobee. Allow the water to have residence time in those lakes so that once it goes into natural river courses, it's less nutrient laden.
Everglades restoration requires sending water south on a regular basis that will meet as closely as possible the natural flow. Everglades restoration advocates want the river of grass, the historic river of grass, to be restored to the greatest spatial and functional extent possible. Can it return to what it was 100 years ago? No, of course not.
The question is that there are environmental groups that have uniquely focused on storage south of the lake, whereas the district and to some extent the Army Corps have identified the next step ought to be storage north of the lake. I don't see that we're at odds with all of the environmental groups. I think there are a number of environmental groups that agree that implementation of the integrated delivery schedule is the appropriate way to go.
We have to recognize that we can't point fingers that somebody else is at fault. I can't underscore heavily enough that we in the coast have created conditions. We've moved into wetlands, just like agriculture has in other areas. We need fresh water for survival. And we crafted solutions, came up with 9 different solutions that how we might be able to fix this problem. Time goes by and the landowner decides they aren't so willing to sell the land anymore. And a new administration comes in and they are not as willing to pursue that opportunity. It doesn't remove the fact that when you did the engineering plan, there was a recognized need. There's no way to really restore the Everglades without storage south, as well as north, west, and east.
96% of the water that goes into the lake comes from the north. And so we've got a lot of water coming in from the north into Lake Okeechobee. And so we've got to do something with that water. And our system has been built good, bad, or indifferent that we can move some water south, we move some water out the east to the St. Lucie estuary and some to the Caloosahatchee. The lake has been accumulating these nutrients over time. It's also been diked to prevent damage from flood. And so, yeah, the lake is serving a different purpose than originally intended. But I think it's also important to point out that the public's perception of the lake is very different than the real perception of the lake. And so you talk to folks that live on the lake, that work on the lake, the water quality in the lake itself is pretty good right now, particularly on the perimeter edges. It's the best that it's been in 20 years.
It's a really complex problem that incorporates a lot of things, from what do we do with all of the rainwater that falls in South Florida to nutrient loading that's a result of a multitude of different inputs. Then we have some problems with different species management, and different agencies have expertise in all of those areas, and so putting them all together is complicated. I think it's really just balancing all of the different project purposes for all of our projects. And there's often a very delicate balance that has to be achieved. I often say that we can't make everybody happy, but what we try to do is not make everybody really mad either. And so when everybody's a little bit mad, we've probably got it about right.
One of the things that I know that in the lake area south of the Okeechobee, in the Everglades, if you will, there's a large amount of structures that the government has built to try to transfer the water from one area to the other, or I'm not sure exactly what they're trying to do with it, but all these things have a problem connected to them as far as trying to get the water flowing from the lake down through the Everglades as it naturally did years ago. And of course you got farmers, you got the sugar guys, everybody's involved in this, and everyone thinks that you're going to step on their toes if you do certain things that have to do with moving the water south.
And thinking that it's going to solve the problem in these years where you have these high discharges, you can't send it south. The Everglades is already chock full. The governor, as a matter of fact, asked for emergency actions by the federal government to let the water out of the conservation areas in April and May, which they did. And because the flood stage was so high in the conservation areas that you're threatening to bust the levees on the eastern coast and flood Fort Lauderdale and Miami. And so you can't put more water in these wet years, and for them to say that the Everglades needs it, they're dry. In these kind of years, the Everglades is not dry, and it's just like everywhere else in South Florida. The Everglades doesn't want the water when it's real wet, and they want it when it's real dry, when everybody else wants the water. And that's how we are in South Florida. We're in feast or famine, so everybody either wants water because we're dry, or we're so wet nobody wants it.
I honestly think the biggest challenge that some people are resisting for political reasons may be the reality that one of the big changes we've got right now is climate. The stuff that happened in January where we had this really unusual rain, we're going to have more unusual rains.
71% of the entire Earth's surface is covered with water. Of that 71%, 96.5% is salt water. It's tied up in our oceans and our seas. The remaining 3.5% is fresh water. And that's composed of glacial frozen water. It's tied up in the ice caps, and the remainder is fresh water that we can use for human consumption.
I'm careful to not try to slide people into despair, but I don't think it's unrealistic to think that some of the geopolitical conflicts that we're going to face in this century are going to be driven by people who don't have enough water. And how important is it? Everybody needs water to live. And so if they don't have access to clean water, that's a problem. And that problem is going to translate into economic or military solutions.
40 of the 50 states in our country have water issues, whether it's pollution or lack of clean water, lack of water you can use for everyday living.
The future of the ocean is limitless. Humans don't have, I believe, in our power, the ability to eliminate life on this planet. We didn't start it and we can't stop it. However, we can pretty handily not make it as habitable for the kind of society that we're used to. So we get this concept of, oh, we're trying to save the ocean. The ocean doesn't need saving. We're saving the people. We're trying to understand how we can continue to have community that we appreciate and thrive off of.
This is a live, vibrant system, and it's where your drinking water comes from. All of this water eventually seeps into the ground, and they pump it out, and they treat it, and they distribute it to your home. So you're getting really cheap water here.
So it can affect your tap water. It more often, though, affects the entire rest of your life. Your recreational life, the quality of the value of your property, the quality of your life, the local economy upon which your life is based.
We're on a peninsula, and we're all the way at the end of that peninsula. If we lose our drinking water supply, I mean, are we gonna have to truck water in? It's a scary thought. You know, we're kind of on our own down here. We can't just magically start pulling it out of a different aquifer. I mean, it's the water in those aquifers, especially the Biscayne and Florida aquifer, comes from the Everglades.
If we don't have access to water, we don't have access to life. That's how serious water is.
So one of the things that I've seen in my time as an ecologist and as a person interested in the environment, one of the things that I have hope from these conversations about the Caloosahatchee River, when the environmental movement started, there was a real sense that there are two sides to the issue. There were the people who were interested in economic health, and there were people who were interested in the environment, and they were arguing against one another. You couldn't protect the environment without damaging the economy. Those days are over. Caloosahatchee is a perfect example of that. We all understand now that the two of them are just linked, that if we're not managing our environment correctly, the economy is going to suffer, and already has suffered. because of the things that have happened as a result of some of these releases. So I have hope that we see that connection, which gets us all on the same page of got to fix this.
We are making progress. It is terribly slow, particularly if you're a small business owner that not only sees loss of income during lake discharges. We've had bait and tackle shops go out of business. Mom and pop shops that have been operating for decades finally had to fold tent and find another job. You know, the realtors together, both on the East Coast and West Coast, realize that lake discharges and the pollution resulting have a tremendous economic impact, not only to their market value, but to these other economic aspects that we just talked about.
There is a massive trickle-down effect to all of this. If I can't sell a house, then that person's not going to be out buying furniture or having it remodeled or painted, and all of these people down the line are losing business. We had a person just last week, he checked in, he walked down to the beach, took a deep breath, couldn't breathe, and went home.
Well, we've already seen it with having lost 123,000 acres of farmland. We've already seen the Atlantic Sugar Mill, the Osceola Sugar Mill, the Moorhaven Co-op. We've seen several mills go out of business. We shut down our Bryant Mill, and so we're down to basically 4 mills left in the area where at one time there used to be 9 mills. A lot of those businesses that had sod and vegetables down in the areas that were taken are out of business. We've already experienced the loss of jobs and all from the government taking land and all. People were promised that, you'd get jobs in building these reservoirs and all that, but none of that happened, and it's short-lived. And so if the Sugarcane Growers Cooperative were to go out of business, it would have a tremendous impact on those communities of Belglade, Pahokee, South Bay, and Clewiston.
I think that the common misconception is that taking 60,000 acres out of production is going to shut down all agriculture in Florida, which we know is not the case. There's hundreds of thousands of acres of sugarcane in the state of Florida, as well as hundreds of thousands of acres of all kinds of other crops. We're not trying to put them out of business. We're trying to get as much land as we need to significantly help this problem with respect to those communities south of the lake.
So it's so damn complex that it would take a battery of lawyers to try to figure out what to do, how to do, and then the bottom line, of course, is the only way it's going to get fixed is by a great amount of money.
Again, the algal organisms release a toxin that affects the neurologic system or the central nervous system. So it affects their brain and that kind of thing. So when they come in, they have difficulty walking, they're very dizzy, they're often very depressed. We see about 4,000 patients a year here at Crow, and a large number of those are affected by red tide. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There are definitely many, many animals who probably go unseen and untreated and probably don't make it.
To sell some of his land, become a willing seller, sell some of his land, be a good neighbor to the people of South Florida. The people of South Florida have been very, very good neighbors to U.S. Sugar. And it is time for U.S. Sugar to repay the debt and be a good neighbor to South Floridians.
So far, the farmers in the EA have said they're not willing sellers. There's already been 123,000 acres taken out of farmland in the Everglades agricultural area. So growers or mills are trying to protect their base, and Sugarcane Growers Cooperative have already said if 60,000 acres were taken out of production in the EAA, they'd go out of business. Because what's going to happen is for Florida Crystals or U.S. Sugar, we send a lot of cane to the co-op. If ours is cut back, we'll cut them back. And if they lose some of their growers also, they can't sustain a hit like that.
They firmly believe we're trying to eliminate the sugar fields altogether and they're all going to lose their jobs, and that's not the case. We just need 360,000 feet of water storage. That's about all you can put down there, short of totally clearing out the sugar fields. A couple years ago, Big Sugar was willing to sell the whole 9 yards. What's changed now, I'm not sure. But I don't see why there's so much resistance to selling the small part that we really think is necessary.
Probably 80% of our money that is generated through the town is generated by U.S. Sugar. Does that make us a corporate town? Yes. Is that a good thing? Yes. You know, we could be another town around the lake. There's no town around the lake like our town. We're the cleanest, we're the sweetest.
Yeah, a bit frustrating that the wetlands in Florida are being destroyed, even though there are a lot of reasons to keep wetlands, and there's been wetlands protection programs going on. We had more than 60% of the Lee County lands used to be wetlands, and now they're less than 20%. And it seemed the losses seem to be accelerating instead of slowing down.
It's clean. See, these people haven't seen this lake. And I hate for people to judge something when they don't have any knowledge about what's going on. You know, they need to look in their own backyards along the Caloosahatchee River and see how many septic tanks there are going down that river. So when we have all of these massive rainfalls that we had this last year, all of that soil percolates with that rain. And those drain fields, where do you think they go? Right into that river. And it goes right on down.
I think we're all to blame because we're all living in the landscape that used to be wetlands, that used to be in large part wetlands. So is it useful to go back and say, well, it started with X or Y, it continues because of X and Y? I don't think so. I think we've had that conversation, and it basically got us nowhere. For many years, even the environmental concerns would say, well, why should the Caloosahatchee get so much water? Leave more water in the lake or send it to the East Coast, and the East Coast would send it to the West Coast. This is not a zero-sum game. We don't need to pit one natural system against the other. We need to be creative and clever enough to solve the problem within the box, within the constraints that we've built. Some things can be changed, some things cannot.
I see every day the amount of people every year that keep coming in and populating Florida, and the development that continues to grow, and the amount of concrete and asphalt that we continue to add. And you know, it takes away from the area for our water to settle and naturally disperse, and it creates more runoff and so forth. And now I think that people are looking for vacant land and trying to find the land to basically use to help create a solution to the challenges that we all face.
What is bad, and I will say this, is why we need storage north of the lake, is back in the days, years and years ago, and still now, you have all the dairy farms up there. The soil is completely different on the north end of the lake than it is on the south end. We have the muck soil. They have the sand. And when those cows do their business, that all permeates into the sand, goes down, gets in the aquifers, and travels into the rivers and comes into Lake Okeechobee. That is a problem.
You would hope you could reason with the Goliath. You would hope you could say, look, you're a big industry, but you need to be on board with this. For your own health and safety and welfare, why don't you come on board with us and see the problem holistically, together? Because we all live here. We all live here. Environmentalists, agriculture, we all want to live in this beautiful area we call Florida. We want it to be sustainable. So if we all want to live here and want this sustainability and have this high quality of environment, then help us do that. And so hopefully we can convince the Goliath to say, come on here, let's get to talking. You've got the strength, you've got the ability to help with this. You don't need all this huge industry. Come on, let's give a little here, and we'll give a little, and we'll try to get this working out.
The thing says no land, no farms, no food, and it ought to also say no jobs, because, you know, if they take away enough land, we are definitely going to close down certain farms. In those 60,000 acres, there's employees, there's production, there's economics. I mean, that gets shut down. There's not the food from those areas, and also anything to do with taking significantly more acreage than the 123,000 acres they've already taken is going to have a phenomenal impact.
Yeah, the answer is we're all contributing to the runoff that we see. There have historically been, higher amounts of runoff coming off of agricultural land, but again, those are a result of practices that were implemented in the 60s and 70s. If you look at today's agriculture, people are implementing overhead irrigation that is very efficient, puts nutrients exactly where and when you want it. Most of citrus has converted to emitters, so the water and the nutrients are very specifically timed. So if you look back at development, you look back at agriculture, there are things that everybody's going to look at and say, gosh, that was not great. Agriculture is a big consumer of water, as is industry and power production compared to potable water. But agriculture wouldn't be there except for the development that's consuming that food. And so, this is a problem. We're not going to solve any of these problems if we point out, specific groups. We're in it together. Typically, you identify a villain when you're trying to raise money. And so those folks that are identifying villains, I think that's really about generating contributions than about solving problems.
The incoming Senate President, Senator Joe Negron, has a plan in this legislative session to purchase up to 60,000 acres of land within the Everglades agricultural area. That land would be used to store about 360,000 acre feet of water, and that would help to reduce the impacts of the coastal estuaries. The cost of that plan is estimated at about $2.4 to $2.5 billion. That would include the cost of land acquisition as well as the construction costs for creating the reservoir and treatment components as well.
Wow, the idea of a political will is a great question. If you listen to the rhetoric before Election Day, everybody was talking about how important it was. But we'll have to see how that plays out, because I don't see any solution to this problem that isn't expensive. And I don't see any solution that won't get more expensive the longer we wait. So we'll see.
We want this to be cured in 3 weeks, right? We want the solution now. And this is going to take multiple decades to really get clarity of solution. But one of the things that I think we really have to have is all of us in the United States, when we cast a ballot for anyone, from your local city council person to the president, you should know in your mind, how is that person going to prioritize natural resources wherever they happen to be at whatever level? But we don't think about that. We had an enormous amount of debate recently in the United States about politicians, and I didn't hear anything substantive about the environment at all.
I don't think they've all really been in the same room at the same time hearing each other talk before last Wednesday. And I don't doubt maybe some of them are finally thinking, well, maybe we all ought to have some sort of a common umbrella over us so that we all hear what everybody else is doing on a more regular basis.
Here's the challenge, the way I see it, and I've been doing this over 22 years. Every time we get a big disaster, you get a lot of new players coming in to try to figure out, well-meaning, how do we solve this problem? Add to that, you have an expanding population, 1,000 people a day moving to Florida. For them, every day is a new challenge. They've never heard this before. They haven't been working on it for decades. They don't understand the history. So you have a huge education curve that you have to bring people in to understand the past and understand the avenues forward.
Government officials who have not been doing what the general taxpayers would have wanted them to do, are a culprit. And they appoint other people as officials, like the governing board of the Water Management District or the head of the DEP, who aren't responsible stewards. They're just people that are in the position to get that job and benefit from what's going on, what the Water Management District does or what DEP does. So so there are people responsible. Yeah, that's pretty well known.
That makes me want to think, okay, the government's at blame. Who put the government in place? Oh, I did that, darn. So it sort of does come full circle back to us, and it's something that I truly believe in, and it is something that we teach kids, is that the people that represent you ought to be representing your environment. And we get lost in the fact that the economics of the world, we're worried about short-term profit margins, but yet we don't recognize that there are really two things that matter to human culture. That is one another, community, and environment. And all of the other economic factors are driven by those two things. And if you have one of those two components, community or environment, out of balance, the whole system becomes imbalanced.
We're now moving forward with a plan to fix the Everglades, but water quality is only a small component of that. And so far, the federal government has not stood up for water quality. They maintain that that's a state responsibility. So we have the federal government who built this system. The Corps of Engineers built these canals and these pump stations. The federal government would build the system that's polluting the Everglades, not taking responsibility for the water quality. They putting all of that on the state.
The political will has to be there. There's not been the political will. First it was the money. Oh, we'd love to do it, except we don't have the money. Well, the state of Florida stepped up to the plate a couple of years ago, passed the amendment, put all kinds of money aside, millions of dollars every year to Land Acquisition Trust Fund. So the money isn't an excuse. And even in the federal level, there's billions of dollars that could be going to these kind of projects. But instead, it's now, oh, well, we're new at this. As a new political leader who just got elected, now we got to go re-educate them every couple of years. So now you get them up to speed, they see the problem, now they've got to have the will to make that change. A will enough to convince their other members of Congress or the legislature to say, come along with me, you got to see this as a real major problem, not only for my district, but the whole state. So come on and help me out here.
We need to agree on a priority and say, this is our priority, we're going to fund it, and we're going to fund it aggressively until the number one item is done, and then we're moving to number two. And so what unfortunately I see happening now is there are disparate voices out there that are talking about this project and that project, and they are outside of what has been agreed by stakeholders, the district and the Army Corps, as this is the work program. Folks in Tallahassee and the federal government that are listening, making allocations, they hear, well, yeah, 70% are saying this, but we hear this and this. You guys aren't all on the same page. We're going to fund other projects. And so I'm concerned that we're losing opportunity to prioritize and fund and put the biggest allocation on the most important project because there's not a unified voice.
Political will is needed, and certainly money is needed. But I want to see money used effectively and efficiently to cause the maximum amount of cleaning of Lake Okeechobee. You clean Lake Okeechobee and you have done a major development, because then you can use any water that goes south is cleaner to begin with, so that the money that you do spend south of the lake is spent more efficiently.
There are so many players that even large groups of people have trouble keeping up with all the moving parts. Whole organizations, from the state side, Department of Environmental Protection and the South Florida Water Management District, the Fish and Game Commission. And on the federal side, you've got U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers. Just keeping up with all of the acronyms is tough.
So it's not just us tree huggers saying, hey, it's the environment, save the fish, save the economies, it's the ecology. It's save the economy. When that person, there are a couple of things they can do. First is they can learn about the thing. They can get up to speed. They can understand the problem. Maybe they just moved here from Massachusetts or Michigan. They don't know much about the area, so learn about it. Find out more about it, the whole issue. Find out what surrounds it. Then, now once you know about it and understand it, get involved, either with an organization or just individually to help do your part, conserve water, or recycle, or do things that are individually cooperative. But join some organization or group that can help in a bigger picture kind of aspect. And get involved with your congressional and political leaders. Call them, write them, text them, email them. They respond. If they get one email from you as an individual, they know that at least 150 to 200 people think just like you. So think of 1,000 of us sending that email. They're all going to go, wow, this is a constituent. I better get down there and pay attention.
So what can an individual do? You can get involved in an environmental organization, but even they have their own agendas. And there's an awful lot of money out here and a lot of politics at play. So it's a tough battle, and it's a very steep learning curve to get involved in the Everglades. But it's a very worthy cause if you decide to get involved.
We could all go eschew electronics and go live in yurts and not have all of the things that we have, but that's not going to happen. So, but if we can instill in everyone something really, really simple, stop using plastic bags from the grocery store, or stop drinking out of single-use disposable water bottles. The things that we do with kids is turn off the faucet while you're brushing your teeth. They love that. They go, oh my word, you can do that. It's like, yeah, it turns out you can. And it makes a difference. And it begins that sense of realization that I am a part of the natural world. And it is a part of me. And I feel better. I have a better life because I'm engaging in nature. It doesn't matter if you're in the middle of Brooklyn or the Mojave Desert. When you take that first step to recognize I'm turning off my sink a little bit, I'm using a little less water because I am a part of the natural world and I'm giving back.
And if our elected officials saw what's happening on these waters and could experience what we experience, I don't see how they could continue to turn a blind eye to it. We constantly are reminded of all the roadblocks, but if they were really up there looking for solutions, they'd be telling us how we overcome the roadblocks, not explaining what the roadblock is. I think that's, public opinion plays a big role in that. If we can get the public behind this and really supportive of it, and if our policymakers see we have an engaged, well-educated electorate, they're going to comply with the demands that we have, and that's, we can't continue to sit here and watch our estuaries die. We need a solution, and we need that now.
We the people of the city of Sanibel hold the factoid and necessity for pure ocean water on the Gulf and Bay sides of the islands. The state and central government seem not to understand that thousands of people's lives are being changed by this pollution.
Yeah, I feel that a lot of kids don't think they have a voice, but from both this experience and my other personal experiences,
I realized that we actually may not have the final say, but we definitely have a little bit of a say.
The world that we live in is fragile and fair, a gift of God's grace that the angels have placed in our care. It's our legacy, my friend, never more to pass this way again. Only passing through here I know. So much to do before I go. Never more to pass this way again. Never more to pass this way again. Never more to pass this way again.